Some towns forget their past. This one couldn't. No matter how many years passed, no matter how quiet the streets became, this case never truly left. It lived in pauses during conversations, in the way people lowered their voices, and in the places everyone knew but rarely mentioned. This is the story of a town that will never forget this case. Welcome to Dark Town Archives, where we uncover the stories that continue long after the headlines disappear. At first glance, this town looked like any other: peaceful streets, familiar faces, a routine built on trust. It was the kind of place where people believed nothing truly bad could happen. And if it did, it would be quickly understood, quickly resolved, and quietly moved past. But this case refused to fade. What happened here didn't just disrupt a single moment in time. It changed how the town saw itself. Before the case, life felt predictable. After it, something shifted. A sense of certainty disappeared, replaced by questions no one could fully answer. The night it began didn't feel dramatic. There were no alarms echoing through the streets, no crowds gathering, no immediate fear spreading through the town. At first, it felt manageable, controlled, explained. And that explanation brought relief. People wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it because questioning it would mean accepting that something far worse might be true. And in a town built on familiarity, doubt felt dangerous. Days passed, then weeks. On the surface, life returned to normal. Shops reopened. Children went to school. Conversations moved on. But beneath that calm, something lingered. The case became a reference point, not spoken about directly, but always present. Certain streets felt different. Certain locations carried weight. People remembered where they were when they first heard about it. They remembered what they felt when they realized this wasn't just another story. At Dark Town Archives, we've seen how some cases embed themselves into communities. Not because of violence alone, but because of uncertainty, because unanswered questions create shadows that time can't erase. This case created those shadows early on. Officials assured the town that everything had been handled, that there was no reason for concern, that the truth was known. And for a while, that reassurance worked. The town wanted to move forward, and it did. But forgetting was never an option, because small details didn't add up, not loudly, not obviously. Just enough to make people uneasy, enough to make the story feel incomplete, enough to make silence feel heavier than answers. Over the years, the case was revisited quietly. Not officially at first, but in private conversations, in moments of reflection, in the questions people asked themselves but never voiced publicly. It became clear that this wasn't just about what happened, it was about what was missed. What made this case unforgettable wasn't just the event itself. It was the way the town responded, the decisions made early, the questions left unasked, the comfort that replaced curiosity, and once that realization settled in, it changed everything. This town learned something most places never expect to learn: that normalcy can be misleading, that peace doesn't guarantee truth, and that moving on doesn't mean healing. The case became part of the town's identity, a reminder that some stories don't end when investigations stop. They continue in memory, in doubt, and in the lessons they leave behind. And as we'll see in the next part, the reason this town will never forget this case isn't just because of what happened, but because of what followed afterward. In the days that followed, the town searched for one thing above all else: reassurance. People wanted to believe that whatever had happened was already understood, already contained, and already behind them. And soon, an explanation arrived that gave them exactly that. It sounded reasonable. Calm, controlled officials spoke with confidence, choosing words carefully. They emphasized that there was no ongoing danger, no reason for alarm, and no need for speculation. The message was clear: life could continue as normal. And for many, that was enough. At Dark Town Archives, we often observe how powerful early explanations can be, especially in close-knit communities. When information comes from familiar voices, it feels trustworthy. Questioning it can feel unnecessary, even disrespectful. So the town accepted it. The explanation spread quickly, repeated in conversations, shared quietly among neighbors, and reinforced by routine. Within a short time, it became the only version of events anyone talked about. The more it was repeated, the more solid it felt. But solid doesn't always mean true. As the weeks passed, the case slipped out of public focus. There were no dramatic updates, no follow-up announcements, no visible changes. That absence of activity sent a subtle message. Nothing more needed to be done. People returned to their routines, but not without hesitation. Some details felt vague. Certain parts of the story were described broadly without specifics. Timelines were simplified. Questions were answered with general statements rather than clarity. But these gaps weren't obvious enough to spark concern. And in a town eager to move forward, concern was unwelcome. At Darktown Archives, we've seen how silence can become a form of agreement. When no one challenges an explanation, it gains strength simply by existing. Over time, it stops being questioned, not because it's proven, but because it's familiar. That's what happened here. The case slowly transformed from an event into a memory, something people referenced briefly, then avoided. Parents spoke about it carefully. Community leaders discouraged speculation. The unspoken rule became clear: don't dig too deep. But not everyone felt at ease. Some residents noticed small inconsistencies. Not enough to accuse, not enough to alarm, but enough to create doubt. Why certain details were never clarified. Why follow-up never happened. Why the case seemed to end so quickly. Those questions stayed quiet. Voicing them felt risky. Questioning the explanation meant questioning authority. It meant disturbing the calm the town worked hard to restore, and in a place where harmony mattered, doubt felt like disruption. So people stayed silent. Years passed, and the explanation hardened into accepted truth. New residents learned it as part of the town's story. Younger generations grew up hearing it without context. Over time, the case felt settled, not because it was resolved, but because it was rarely revisited. Yet, the town never fully forgot. The explanation had closed the case, but it hadn't closed the questions. They lingered beneath the surface, resurfacing in moments of reflection, in private conversations, and in the unease people couldn't quite explain. This was no longer just about what happened. It was about how quickly the town chose certainty over curiosity, and that choice would matter later, because explanations built on comfort don't age well as standards change, as perspectives shift, and as time creates distance. What once felt convincing can begin to feel fragile. That's exactly what happened here. In the next part, we'll explore the moment when this case was finally looked at again, and how a small detail overlooked for years forced the town to confront what it had accepted too easily. For a long time, the case lived quietly in the background of the town's history. It wasn't actively discussed, but it was never truly gone. It existed in the spaces between conversations, in the hesitation before certain questions were answered, and in the way people reacted whenever the past was mentioned. Then, years later, something changed. It didn't begin with an official announcement or a sudden revelation. It began with a closer look, a review, a moment when someone decided to examine the old records not to challenge the story, but simply to understand it better. At Darktown Archives, we've seen how turning points rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, often disguised as routine. When the case files were reopened, the first thing that stood out wasn't a shocking detail. It was the lack of detail. Reports were brief. Summaries replaced explanations. Decisions were recorded, but the reasoning behind them was often missing. What once felt efficient now felt incomplete. As the timeline was reconstructed, small gaps became visible. Certain moments were grouped together instead of examined individually. Some actions were described without clear context. Others were assumed rather than verified. None of it was dramatic, but none of it felt solid either. One detail, in particular, stood out. It had been mentioned early on, then quietly dismissed. At the time, it didn't fit the explanation the town had accepted, so it was set aside. No follow-up, no clarification, no second look. Now, years later, that detail felt different. Why had it been dismissed so easily? Why hadn't it been explored further? The answers weren't about wrongdoing or intent. They were about comfort. Investigators believed they already understood the case, so they didn't feel the need to explore information that complicated the narrative. And the town, eager to move forward, never pushed for more. Comfort had replaced curiosity. At Dark Town Archives, this is a pattern we see often. Once an explanation feels reassuring, questioning it feels unnecessary. But reassurance is not the same as truth. As the review continued, more inconsistencies surfaced. Witness statements that were never revisited. Timelines that relied on assumption instead of confirmation. Procedures that were considered acceptable at the time, but would no longer meet modern standards. Taken alone, none of these issues proved anything together. They painted a troubling picture. The case may have been closed before it was fully understood. News of the re-examination spread slowly through the town. Some people felt relief. Finally, someone was asking the questions they had kept to themselves for years. Others felt uneasy. Not because they feared the truth, but because revisiting the past meant admitting the town might have been wrong, and that realization was uncomfortable. The town had built its peace on acceptance. Challenging the case meant challenging that peace. It meant acknowledging that certainty had come too quickly and that silence had filled the space where answers should have been. As discussions began quietly, the tone shifted. The case was no longer just something that happened long ago. It became something unresolved, something unfinished. People started to see familiar places differently. Streets that once felt ordinary now carried memory. Buildings that once felt neutral now felt connected to unanswered questions. The case wasn't just part of history anymore, it was part of the present. And once doubt enters a story, it doesn't leave easily. This was the moment the town realized why it would never forget this case. Not because of the event itself, but because of everything that followed the decisions, the assumptions, the silence. In the next part, we'll explore how the town reacted when these doubts could no longer be ignored, and how facing the past proved more difficult than anyone expected. When the doubts could no longer be ignored, the town didn't respond with anger or outrage. It responded with something quieter: discomfort. A heavy, lingering discomfort that settled into conversations, community meetings, and even daily routines. People didn't argue openly. They hesitated, they paused, they chose their words carefully. For years, the town had lived with an explanation that felt safe. It allowed people to move forward without reopening old wounds. But now, that sense of safety was being challenged, and not everyone was ready for that. Some residents welcomed the renewed attention. They felt relief knowing that the questions they had carried silently were finally being taken seriously. For them, the case had never truly been closed. It had simply been set aside. Others felt threatened. Not because they were hiding anything, but because revisiting the past meant accepting that the town's sense of certainty may have been misplaced. In a small community, reputation matters. Being known as the town with an unresolved case felt unsettling. At Dark Town Archives, we've seen how communities often resist revisiting uncomfortable truths, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that questioning the past will disrupt the present. Town discussions became tense. The case was mentioned cautiously, often followed by silence. Some people argued that too much time had passed. Others insisted that reopening the case would only cause unnecessary pain. Phrases like, "We've moved on, and what good will it do now?" became common, but moving on doesn't erase doubt. As conversations continued, something shifted. People began to realize how little they actually knew. Details they thought were clear now felt vague. Events they believed were settled now seemed incomplete. The confidence that once surrounded the case began to weaken. Local officials found themselves under quiet scrutiny. No accusations were made publicly, but trust was no longer automatic. Past decisions were being viewed through a different lens. Procedures that once felt routine now felt rushed, and still, resistance remained. Some feared that acknowledging mistakes would damage the town's image. Others worried about what unanswered questions might lead to. The idea that the case might never be fully resolved was unsettling. But so was the idea that it had been closed too quickly. At Dark Town Archives, we often say that the most difficult part of any case isn't discovering new information. It's accepting what it reveals about ourselves. This town was facing that moment. Guilt began to surface, not guilt over what happened, but guilt over what didn't happen. The questions that weren't asked. The assumptions that weren't challenged. The relief that replaced curiosity. The town hadn't failed because it didn't care. It had failed because it cared too much about preserving normalcy, and normalcy can be deceptive. As the case was discussed more openly, people started to understand why it had never faded. It wasn't just about the event, it was about the silence that followed. The silence that allowed uncertainty to linger and grow. Familiar streets felt different now. Places once seen as ordinary carried weight. The town was being forced to confront a truth it had avoided for years, that moving on too quickly can leave wounds unhealed. This realization didn't bring answers, but it brought awareness. And awareness changed everything. Because once a community begins to question its past, it can't simply return to the comfort of certainty. It must decide whether to keep protecting the story it told itself, or accept the uncertainty that comes with honesty. In the final part, we'll explore what remained unanswered, what the town ultimately accepted, and why this case became something the community would never forget. In the end, the town didn't receive the kind of closure it once hoped for. There was no single revelation that answered every question, no moment when the past was neatly explained and put to rest. Instead, what remained was something quieter, understanding. The understanding that some stories don't end cleanly. Over time, the town learned to live with uncertainty. People stopped expecting final answers and started focusing on what the case had taught them. The conversations changed. They became less about blame and more about reflection, less about what happened that night, and more about what happened afterward. At Dark Town Archives, we've seen that this is often how lasting impact is created. Not through dramatic conclusions, but through lessons that reshape how people think. This case became one of those lessons. Residents began to recognize how easily reassurance had replaced investigation, how comfort had outweighed curiosity, and how silence, even when well-intentioned, had allowed doubt to grow. The town realized that forgetting would have been easier, but remembering was more responsible. That responsibility changed the community. People became more willing to ask questions, more cautious about accepting simple explanations, more aware that even familiar places deserve careful attention. The town didn't lose its sense of identity. It refined it. Normalcy was no longer defined by the absence of problems, but by the willingness to face them. The case also became a quiet point of reference. New generations learned about it not as a mystery to fear, but as a reminder that truth requires patience, that understanding takes effort, and that moving on too quickly can leave important questions behind. Some questions remain unanswered to this day, but those unanswered questions are exactly why the town will never forget this case. Not because it represents failure, but because it represents growth. Growth that came too late to change the past, but not too late to influence the future. At Dark Town Archives, we believe these stories matter precisely because they are unfinished. They show how real communities respond to uncertainty, how people adapt when certainty fades, and how awareness can emerge even without resolution. This case didn't just leave a mark on one town, it offered a lesson to any community that believes it's immune to doubt. A lesson that peace and truth are not the same thing, and that silence should never replace understanding. If there is one takeaway from this story, it's this. A town doesn't remember a case forever because of what happened once. It remembers it because of what it learned. If this documentary helped you understand why some cases never fade, consider subscribing to Dark Town Archives for more educational, research-based crime documentaries that explore the stories beneath ordinary places. If you believe these lessons matter, like this video and share it with others who value awareness, accountability, and truth. Because some cases aren't meant to be forgotten. They're meant to be understood.